My other, I mean, you can see it happening, that the press is beleaguered, you know, that all of the usual beasts are rallying to its defence, the sense that you can do anything in the name of the press is being exercised. I think a number of the people who have very much pushed the Leveson process, of whom Steve is one, Martin Moore at the Media Standards Trust is another, that this process has been driven by reformers, most of whom were traduced for several years, but who in a sense got there. I think, in a way, Julian is right. The problem is what will happen next. So I think it's newsroom culture, and I think that would be best protected by getting Honora O'Neill to...
become Prime Minister.
No, but we would be... Yes, well, okay, let's have Honora. Well, I shall put that to Honora. But, you know, somebody of Honora's basically sensibleness, but with the authority of Cambridge behind her and being a philosopher, which, you know, we should have all read philosophy because it kind of makes you sound grand, coming up with a really elegant, frankly Kantian description of the public interest, which can then be appealed to as a defence. And I think that is the thing that I've got out of Leveson. For years one's known that these newspapers were behaving improperly. For years one's known that that was a product of a managerial culture. I have no problems with newspapers and politicians being very close. Why wouldn't they be? That's not a problem. Of course they would be. They're in the same business. But I do have a problem with how that has been managed in the commercial interest of a particular organisation. So those things need to be... I don't want to regulate politicians out of the media, but I do want to regulate, as it were, for what is in art, for some very simple, elegant description of what is in the public interest that can be appealed to and defended, so that ferociously fierce, nasty journalism can survive.
Steve.
Thanks. Well, as Pete hinted, when you started by saying I'm taking leave, I thought you were going to say taking leave of my senses, which is sometimes how I feel. And you can start at... Fignola, who's helping me do a research proposal at the moment, is desperately trying to drag me away from this sort of bubble of Leveson, because you become kind of so immersed in it. Everything else sort of pales into insignificance. And I said to the others before we started that what I really want to do is have a rant, because just out of interest, how many of you watched some of Michael Gove yesterday? Right. Did it make you angry? Good. Okay. Well, I'm still angry.
Watching him,
Insufferably smug, nasty, clearly just does not understand. I don't know where he was when the victims were giving evidence in the first module of Leveson, but he started banging on about the need to protect the idea of giving offence. Well, when Charlotte Church stands up and says that when they splashed her father's affair all over the front page of the News of the World, and her mother then tried to commit suicide, and the News of the World went to her mother and said, we want the inside story of your attempted suicide, or we will publish next week another front page splash with more gory details about your husband's affair. That is not trying to give offence. That is the kind of vindictive, bullying, intimidating, I wouldn't even call it journalism. It is just vindictiveness, which, as Jean said, has become the hallmark of a few actually, but a very powerful few newspaper newsrooms. And for a senior cabinet minister to stand up there and talk about the need to protect giving offence is to fundamentally misunderstand what the problem is actually about. And the fact that he was actually a journalist for many years, writing on the Times, makes it even more difficult to stomach. So that really made me quite angry. A couple of things. I'm sort of picking up on what Julian and Jean have said. Incidentally, a quick add, because Jean was talking about the notion of Rupert's phrase of one rogue reporter. Richard Pepiat, who some of you might remember, very courageously resigned from Desmond's Daily Star, where he was a journalist, and spilt the beans in a way that very, very few journalists, I was going to say have had the courage to do, that's not fair, have felt able to do, because they've got careers, they've got families, they've got mortgages. So very few are prepared to put their heads above the parapet and say, this is what we are asked to do in the name of journalism. But he did, and his evidence is really worth reading. The things he was told to do in the interests of journalism. Go out and find a story that demonstrates how Muslims are holding this country to ransom. It was homophobic, it was racist, it was, and it was a very specific editorial agenda. That's not journalism. Anyway, Richard, who is a very, very funny guy, is putting together a one-man stand-up comedy show called One Rogue Reporter. And he's actually, it's being backed by Steve Coogan, amongst others, and it's in Edinburgh for the whole of August. So go and see it, because I know for a fact he's got some very interesting, exclusive footage and information. I suppose I really want to make 2 points, I guess. One is about what do we want out of this? We want a new regulatory settlement. And I think Julian's right. I think Levison's going to provide something, and he's also right that actually the real battle is going to come in Parliament. It's going to be the big question is this is a defining moment in British public life. Are our politicians really prepared to grasp this nettle and say, now we're in charge and we've had enough? Now, Tony Blair, I don't know if anyone saw his evidence, and I know he was ridiculed and people called him, it was a great performance and, you know, essentially he's a liar. I actually found him wholly credible, and his explanation of why Labour did what they did, I found wholly credible. Essentially, what he was saying was, if we wanted to do the things we wanted to do to make people's lives better, we could not afford to take on the press because we'd have had to clear the decks. That would have been our obsession for at least 2 or 3 years of a parliament. You can't afford to do that in politics. This is that moment. But it's a moment at which the political parties will have to come together, because if there is a slightest chink between them, it will be driven through by people like Michael Gove and others, who have a very different view of journalism. And I think here we come to the dividing line, actually. Jean talked about the nature of the public interest. I want to talk about the BJ article a little bit, the BJR research a little bit. The dividing line, which is what actually is journalism in the public interest. How far do we go down the Kelvin Mackenzie, Paul Dacre line, which is slightly caricatured, but if they're buying the newspapers and the public are interested in it, it's in the public interest, therefore it should be published. And who are you, snotty-nosed, Guardian reading, Islington living liberals, to say otherwise? You know, just take your own principles, stick them up your backside, and leave the rest of us to get on with real life. That is essentially where they're coming from. And that kind of First Amendment absolutism underlies a lot of what Gove was saying yesterday, and a lot of what journalists that I actually respect come out with. Now, as I say, underlying all that is the nature of the public interest. So, an ad for this article. What we did, I came up with some questions which essentially tried to put to a random population sample a number of 8 different scenarios, okay? And the question was simply, should this story be published? And they were given 3 answers. The story is definitely in the public interest and should be published. The story is not necessarily in the public interest, but nevertheless it should be published. The story is a private matter and should not be published. So that second answer was very specifically aimed at allowing people to say, okay, it may not be in the public interest, but actually I'm a bit nosy, I'm a gossip, I like that sort of story, yes, it should be published. Now the one, as I say, there were 8 scenarios, I'm not going to go through them, but the one that I think is critical for understanding where the public attitudes lie is the fifth one, which is a well-known England footballer who is married with young children is having an affair. Okay? These are precisely the kind of role models that it is argued by people like Paul Dacre ought to be held up to public scrutiny, and if they misbehave, they ought to be splashed all over newspapers, because that is the role of newspapers. So, this was a well-known, and I emphasise, it was a very carefully phrased question, a well-known England footballer, plays for the country, married, young children, having an affair. Right, how many thought the story was in the public interest and should be published? Anyone want to have a go? Give me a percentage.
60.
We have 60 and 0. 6%. Okay. Let's go to the other extreme. Okay, let's say the middle one. The story is not necessarily in the public interest, but nevertheless should be published. How many?
10.
Who said 30? Spot on. Very good. Well done, Geoffrey.
He's met him before.
There's a man in touch with the public psyche. Now, this is the crucial one. The story is a private matter and should not, in bold letters, be published. 58%. 58%. That is, nearly two-thirds are quite clear that that is a private story and should not be published. Now, as I say, you can query the questions. We can't query the fact that, I mean, it is, it's YouGov, so it's a kosher research company, genuine representative sample. If any of you are tweeting, please tweet that, and please link to the BJR and that research, because surprise, surprise, it's not been published. Sorry, it's not been publicised. I'm hoping it's going to get a little bit more purchased over the next few days. The general reporting around phone hacking has been abysmal. And I finish with one final point. At the core of all of this, and this is essentially what Julian was saying, and he's absolutely right. At the core of all this is the fact that for at least 30 years we have been cozying up, not we, the politicians have been cozying up to the major media conglomerates, in particular to Rupert Murdoch, but it's not just Murdoch, it's Dacre as well, it's the major media proprietors. We have been falling over ourselves to relax our controls on media ownership, and we've allowed a huge corporate machine to build up, which almost inevitably has led to corruption on a grand scale. And we're not just talking about corruption of of newsrooms, we're talking about the police and we're talking about politicians. And the cathartic nature of what we're seeing now through Leveson, again, I think gives us a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not just for a new regulatory system, for decent, honest, and as Jean said, robust and rigorous journalism in the public interest, but also for introducing media plurality rules which will make sure that this never happens again. I'm reasonably optimistic, but as Julian and Jean said, there's a huge political battle to come.
Okay, we'll discuss the issue of product placement as an ethical issue later. What I wanted to move on to, and I want to force my panellists to be crisp on this, and crisp and precise. You are the jury, yeah? You are formulating the rules. You've all suggested, in one manner or another, that there should be, whatever regulation there should be a public interest defence, yeah? How would you define public interest? And are there any journalistic practices that you would exclude from even a public interest defence?